Who is the Bantamweight GOAT? Is it Merab Dvalishvili, the current active champion, or is the legacy pick Dominick the Dominator Cruz? If you saw my last video, then you already know my pick. I think Merab Dvalishvili is the Bantamweight GOAT, but I also think it's important to justify your reasoning sometimes. So today I want to compare their careers, show you my criteria for what I think makes the greatest bantamweight of all time, and then give my reasoning behind everything. Now, before I get into anything, I do ask that you leave a like on the video, and if you do enjoy it, please do subscribe. Helps me keep doing this, helps me keep pushing out videos. Now, before jumping straight into their careers and all these different factors, I think it's important to lay out my criteria when evaluating the greatness of a fighter. Whilst your overall ability is definitely a part of my equation, it's not the whole thing, and I want to say this to say that the greatest fighter isn't necessarily the best fighter. We could come up with maybe a third pick that might just be the best overall fighter when compared to every other bantamweight, but that doesn't mean they're the greatest. For example, if I had to pick who I thought the best bantamweight was, it would be a debate for me between Peter Yan and Henry Cejudo. To me, Merab and Dominick Cruz wouldn't be in that conversation. But I also acknowledge that neither of those fighters have the achievements necessary to be considered the GOAT of bantamweight. So on that note, my criteria consists of three things. The first is your overall ability. You have to be good. This is why I don't consider people like Chuck Liddell and Tito Ortiz part of the light heavyweight GOAT debate, because to them, they are good for their era, but they just don't compare to the modern UFC. The second criteria is going to be your legacy. In this, I mean, how is your run as a fighter compared to others historically? This is why certain blatant achievements are important to me, like being a champion, title defenses, consecutive title defenses. And thirdly, and what I would consider most simply, is going to be just who have you beaten, your resume, who have you lost to? This is going to be the simplest way, I think, of evaluating a fighter, whilst adding in the other two. But I think that's enough of an intro, and it's time to actually get into comparing the fighters. Firstly, I think we should start with legacy, as it's probably the simplest here to define. Starting with Dominick Cruz, I mean, this guy has 4 consecutive title defenses, and I say 4 because I count the WEC ones as they are the same division, just under a different name. Now, a lot of people would consider this the prime era of Dominick Cruz, and we can talk about that a little more later, but what really works for Dominick Cruz here is that he didn't lose his belt. He was stripped of it due to injury, so he doesn't have that knock against him of losing it in his prime. The only knockoff you can really think of against this era of Dominick Cruz is they never went up against Renan Barão, which is sort of fair, but he also beat TJ Dillashaw, coming off so many injuries, who destroyed Renan Barão completely. Now, this is where his legacy does get a little shaken, I guess. All of this was done in a very infant level of bantamweight. Not to say that the bantamweights back then were bad, but it definitely didn't reach its modern age that it has now, and even back in 2016, 2017, 2015, right? And when he did regain his belt, within a year he had lost it. And just to compile with that a little, what makes it a little worse is that seemingly Dominick Cruz in the UFC just did avoid TJ Dillashaw, because after that first fight, nobody could really make out who won it. It was one of the most closest title fights in UFC history. Now, this is diving a little into resume, but I just want to say I'm not here to discredit that win. I will give him all the credit in the world for that win specifically, close fight or not. But anyways, he beats TJ Dillashaw, and you don't give him the rematch, which fair enough, he's not a long-reigning champion, and you fight Uriah Faber instead, which is a very weird fight. He wasn't a real contender at that point, but fair enough. You want to do that fight, you want to do that fight. Then TJ had beaten Sun Sao in that time. TJ should have gone the next fight, and the fight against Cody was booked in October. TJ beat Sun Sao in August. There was no reason that TJ shouldn't have gone that fight, but instead they went with Cody Garbrandt, seemingly to avoid having Dominick Cruz fight TJ Dillashaw. And to me, the fact that he avoided a dude and still lost the belt in a year is the biggest fault I can give against his legacy, which I don't know if it's a huge fault, but it definitely is one. It is an asterisk. And to make one final point about the legacy of Dominick Cruz, I think realistically his greatest attribute is that his longevity is off the charts. This guy beat Pedro Munoz in 2021, and he took rounds off Chito Vera in 2022, and he was a champion in 2010. That's ridiculous. And this isn't some dude starting in the 90s and hanging on through the 2000s where the skill level was just so much lower. This is the 2010s into the 2020s. It's absolutely ridiculous. Now I want to discuss Merab's legacy. And it's not going to be as colorful as Dominick Cruz's, quite obviously. The guy is a champion. He does have a defense, but he's not rocking like 5, 6 title wins like Cruz is. But yet it still is very impressive because he is so dominant in the modern era of Bantamweight, the best era of Bantamweight in my opinion. And he has taken out many past champions, which, to be fair to Cruz, he didn't exactly have the opportunity to do, but he did take out some. And I think this is why some people are saying that this is premature and that we're jumping the gun, because when you compare legacies, what does Merab have that Cruz doesn't have more of? Even his 12-fight win streak, Cruz did it whilst being a champion during that time for a long part of that time. And the really big difference there is when you're a challenger, the person who you're booked to fight is the one game planning for you. When you're the champion, everyone in the division is game planning. So on just the point of legacies, you got to think that Cruz has a massive advantage over Merab. He has the more well ironed out legacy, which makes sense. Merab's still in the middle of his career. Well, middle to end, but that is what it is. And I mean, you have to think, if Dominick Cruz has obviously the better just historical run, then you have to think that Merab needs to excel in other areas, which, you know, frankly, he does. And this is the part of the conversation where we get into resumes. We're talking names on paper with just a little bit of context thrown in there. And to just break format for a second, I want to start with Merab's resume, as I think it's the least complicated of the two. I think the best point for Merab when we're talking about his resume is that we are probably just in the best era of bantamweight right now, and we are left at a point right now where there are practically no contenders left for Merab to fight. Even the people he hasn't directly fought, like a Davison Figueiredo or a Corey Sandhagen, have been beaten by other people on this list. And to me, the names that really need no context are Petr Yan, Sean O'Malley, and Umar Nurmagomedov. In that you have Petr Yan, who's a elite striker with elite anti-wrestling. Umar Nurmagomedov, that's an elite wrestler. Sean O'Malley, that's an elite striker. I mean, right there, you can make the argument that he's been a top 10 wrestler and 2 top 10 strikers in the UFC, which is just ridiculous. Like I said, to me, those are uncontentious. He beat Sean and Umar comfortably and destroyed Petr Yan. Next, we have Jose Aldo and Marlon Moraes, who were both past their primes, but Marlon Moraes was past his prime in that he took some bad knockouts, he was way too timid, he wasn't that same beast, but we saw that in the Merab fight. He did show us that prime form and still lost. And yes, Jose Aldo was past his prime, but he was still a very high contender. He had just destroyed Chito Vera, and in a 3-round fight where Merab is far less dangerous, Merab still completely nullified him. And while some people will add in Cejudo to the resume, to me that fight is not very impressive because Cejudo's conditioning in that fight is absolutely destroyed. And there's a temptation to say that that was Merab's doing, but I actually don't think so because Cejudo has fought at 10 times the pace he fought with Merab. Look at the Marlon Moraes fight, and he was nowhere near as tired. I think this was obviously just him getting older and outside factors. And I mean, in that first round, Merab was very timid to strike and shoot on him. He did shoot once. Cejudo defended the takedown, reversed him, and even rocked him in that round. All that fight really convinced me of was that a prime Cejudo probably would just destroy Merab. But that doesn't affect his resume too much to me because I think he's also destroyed people that would have given Cejudo a very hard time, like a Petr Yan. So overall, to me, his resume is still very elite. And now, inevitably, it's time to talk about Dominick Cruz's resume, and I think this is going to be a very controversial part of the video, as I really do not think it's that good. Again, the uncontentious ones to me are TJ Dillashaw and Uriah Faber. Uriah, whilst obviously a top dude in the division, was never really that number 2 outside of the 1 year that he did fight Dominick Cruz. Afterwards came Henin, and it became very obvious. And TJ Dillashaw, I have no complaints about that. It was a really close fight, but at the same time, Cruz won fair and square off a lot of injuries. So that fight to me is so legacy defining, so resume defining. And Cruz did fight Uriah again in 2016, but at that point, Uriah was coming off like 2 fights before that, losing to Frankie Edgar, and he hadn't gotten a good win in like 3 years. He was staying in that top 5 just basically by killing prospects that were like 8, 10, 13. He got it off beating rank 13, Frankie Saenz. And like I said earlier, I think this was part of a plan to just avoid a Dillashaw rematch. And to be frank, I know people love to bring up Joseph Benavidez and Mighty Mouse, but ignoring the fact that they weren't in their natural divisions, these guys weren't reaching their prime for another half decade. I don't know why, at this point in their career, where these guys are not accomplished, why we're rating them so highly. I understand they are great later on, but at this point, they're basically infants in the sport. I understand on paper that these wins aged really well, but that's only if we add zero context to the mix. And I'm going to be honest, if I do that to Merab, it becomes even less of a challenge to compare these resumes, so we can't pick and choose here. We have to add context to everything. Which really does lead me to my conclusion that, yeah, Merab just has a way better resume. And to be honest, that makes sense. He's fighting in the modern era of bantamweight. Cruz had his title reign back in 2010 to 2012 and a brief stint in 2016, which I've already talked about how he lost very fast. Which leads me into my final point of this discussion, just being their overall abilities, and we don't really have to break this up by fighter. We can just really compare them. Yes, Cruz is a far better striker. You look at the boxing, he's a much better boxer than Merab. The footwork, the fundamentals, everything. But at the same time, I think what really works in Merab's favor is that he's such a good anti-striker. He's fought the best boxers out there, and he has nullified them in almost every regard. And yes, this is a component of his grappling, but I think this just opens up so many striking opportunities for him. There's a reason he rocked Umar in the 5th. He was able to almost finish O'Malley in the 4th. Go back and watch the end of that 4th round. It is brutal. Look at Petr Yan's face at the end of that fight. He even KO'd Marlon Moraes, but that was more ground and pound, to be fair. It opens up way too many opportunities for him. And to be fair to Cruz in this discussion, take something like wrestling, which is, Merab's best attribute. I think in terms of takedown entries, just pure takedowns, I think Dominick Cruz is better. I think Merab only pulls ahead because of the amount that he shoots. Which brings me to my final point, being conditioning. Cruz was known for his conditioning. He set such a high pace, but the fact is that people were able to out-condition him. People like Mighty Mouse. Mighty Mouse, you go back and you look at the commentary for that fight, they were talking about how Mighty Mouse was setting a very high pace for Cruz and that Cruz was struggling at times to keep up with it. Now, he did win that fight by outskilling Mighty Mouse, but conditioning-wise, he's able to be out-conditioned. Merab can't be. Now, I don't want to go too far in depth comparing every attribute. I think that's, something you can do later on, just not for this video. But overall, I do think Merab is the better fighter, just in general. And with that, I think it's time to go to the conclusion. To some degree, this comes down to what you value. Yes, Cruz has the better legacy, and I'm not going to take that away from him. But for me, personally, just thinking that Merab is the better overall fighter and thinking that he's just beat way better names, I have to go with Merab. To me, Merab Dvalishvili is the bantamweight GOAT.